So while I continue to work on other projects, unfortunately since I've gotten a new job, this process has been slowed somewhat. One thing that I've been wanting to do is to reflect, however briefly, on the relationship between St. Thomas's and Pseudo-Dionysius's conceptions of what we would call the self-diffusiveness of the good. That is, the good or goodness considered as self-outpouring or self-communicative. Now, to give a very brief definition of this concept, I've spoken about it multiple times on this channel, I think illustrations are quite helpful. For example, think of something like the light of the sun, or heat produced from a flame, or even sacred procreation. Each of these things are good, and by virtue of their goodness, they produce their own like, and in so doing, draw others to partake of their perfective goodness. You can recall back to the last video where I elucidated the more philosophically robust and scholastic definition of perfection that can maybe help you get a better sense of what I more precisely mean by the term, by the way. Now, to my mind, this is a very critically important concept. It's very central to my own thinking on how to discern the relationship between divine simplicity and God's inner Trinitarian life, as well as my own rationale for arguing why the incarnation itself can be rationally expected. And since I consider this argument for the incarnation to be apologetically necessary, particularly in this day and age, I think it's important to explore how this concept is approached by two of the most influential philosophical and theological thinkers the Church has given us. Now, before we go on to explore this concept proper, I think we should start off here with a preliminary clarification of what we mean when we use the term goodness itself, and this can help illuminate what we might mean by considering the good as self-diffusive. Now, Aristotle's baseline definition of the good is more or less summed up by that which all things desire. Now, to broaden this a bit, we could describe the good as that which all things tend toward as the fulfillment of their perfective capacities. With this in mind, it shouldn't be too difficult to discern why St. Thomas considers goodness and being to be convertible with each other. According to his reasoning, perfection is always determined by the degree to which a thing is more or less actual. And so if goodness is defined by that towards which a thing is inclined as the fulfillment of that thing's perfective capacity, then goodness must be understood as actuality in its full richness, and therefore it takes on the character of a final cause. Now this, I suspect some of you may be aware, does indeed come into a bit of conflict with the more Dionysian, maybe Neoplatonic approach to this question, which is rather adamant in placing the good as prior to and even beyond being. Now, one reason for this is that goodness seems more overarching than being when one considers its causal scope and its causal ontological range. One way to illustrate this a bit is to consider how, in order for a thing to come into being at all, it must necessarily be tending towards some perfective fulfillment, right, in order to come into being at all. But if this is true, then it must be drawn toward the good before it even receives being, and as such, the good would have to precede being, and therefore in the divine, goodness would transcend being, even as being is the first fruit of the good. Now, for St. Thomas, I think, in order to defend his own understanding of the convertibility of being and goodness, I think it would be a good idea to transition from that into discussing the self-diffusiveness of the good more directly. According to this notion, there is something about the nature of goodness as such which tends toward self-communication, or pouring out of itself to another. It is not content simply to remain static, rather the very essence of its own activity is to draw others to partake of its perfective nature. Hence, for St. Thomas, as distinct from Dionysius, goodness takes on the character of a final cause, not an efficient cause. It communicates itself to others so that others may participate in it. This is why St. Thomas is so insistent on the final cause being the cause of causes. A thing is brought into being precisely so that it may circularly return back to partake more fully and richly of its perfective source, the very essence of the good itself, that is God. And thanks to St. Thomas's existential metaphysics, a thing's initial reception of existence, that is, by virtue of the efficient cause it receives existence in the first place, This initial reception of existence is only the first incomplete phase of the act of existence. For St. Thomas, the act of existence is brought to its full richness only when that thing in question achieves the perfective end for which it was brought into existence, that is, to abide in whatever good befits the thing's nature. The good, therefore, far from transcending actuality altogether, is, in truth, on this more Thomistic reading, actuality in its full richness. In locating the good not in some realm that superessentially surpasses being, but rather abides within the very depth of being as such, St. Thomas sheds additional light on what it means for the good to be self-diffusive. As the final cause of all things, the reason why things are given the gift of existence in the first place is so that they may, through conforming to his likeness, stamped in each form or essence, be drawn ever more intimately to himself. It is this attracting purpose for which the good is said to be self-diffusive or self-outpouring that St. Thomas emphasizes in his treatment of this topic, whereas for Dionysius, the self-diffusiveness or self-outpouring of the good speaks more to the fact of God's overflowing processions outside of himself. Now, these two views, I would say, are not in total conflict with each other, but they do approach this from different metaphysical angles. For St. Thomas, his Aristotelian metaphysics of act and potency enable him to locate the good within actuality, which always stands in absolute priority to potency. Whereas for Dionysius, the role of potency is not really articulated in Aristotelian terms, and so it would seem only natural to attribute the capacity for goodness to encompass something like potency as demonstrating its transcendence of being altogether, since potency is kind of seen by him as a relative non-being. So if the good is able to touch even that, then one would have to sort of say that it transcends being altogether if it's able to stretch into what is sort of understood as relative non-being. Now, because for St. Thomas, though, potency is already a form of being, the role of act as perfective of potency enables him to locate the good within the fullness of actuality itself, and thereby approach goodness through the lens of final causality, whereby existing things, by virtue of their acts of existence, are drawn to participate in the full richness of that initial actuality that they received from their efficient causes. Now, that full richness is the final cause, which is to participate in the good himself, who outpours out of his own fecund love a share in his own likeness to creatures, so that they might be drawn more intimately into participation of his own life. Now, to maybe illustrate what I just said in a bit more clear terms, I'm just going to quote for you the words of Fran O'Rourke, who wrote very eloquently on this topic, and he says, quote, "The notional division between being and goodness, efficiency and finality, is ultimately resolved in the unity and simplicity of God, who as the fullness of being is at once efficient and final cause. In his concept of God as ipsum esse subsistens, efficient and final cause, St. Thomas can incorporate the Neoplatonic primacy of the good into his own priority of being by attributing causal priority to God as universal end of all things. Indeed, by giving priority precisely to finality, he emphasizes even more strongly Dionysius's own view of the primacy of the good. For Aquinas, it is the final cause, that is, as the supreme instance of goodness, that God creates and loves all things. Indeed, Aquinas thus goes further than Dionysius, giving precedence universally to goodness by interpreting the diffusion of the good as the principle of finality itself, the first and final reason why things are created. With due reverence to for the inadequacy of the formulation, we could say, for the lack of contrast, that the concept of God, considered as the summum bonum or supreme good, drawing all things toward full and final fruition, is more ultimate than the concept of God as efficient creative cause, which inaugurates things initially into existence. It is for this purpose of finally assimilating things to himself that God indeed creates beings. The reason for creation is the union of the creatures with God as their final end." Unquote. So considered in light of this, I think you can begin to see why I consider this doctrine to be so pivotal in drawing the link between classical theism on the one hand and the rational plausibility of the incarnation on the other. If it can be argued that God truly is goodness himself, and we understand that God is goodness itself as self-diffusive according to the order of final causality in particular, which is St. Thomas's insight, then it would stand to reason that if God so chooses to create, then he creates not merely in order to proceed outside of himself toward finite reality, but principally in order that finite realities created as a result of this outward divine procession be drawn back to the source from which they came, so that they may partake of the perfective goodness of that source. And because, as St. Thomas says, the higher the good, the more intimately and fully that good is communicated, it would also stand to reason that it would be fitting, and it would be only fitting, that God would diffuse the goodness that he is in such a way that would draw the cosmos to himself in the fullest and most intimate manner conceivable. Now, I do fully recognize that St. Thomas himself argues that the incarnation would not have happened had man not sinned, but I would insist that this argument for why it is fitting in itself, which he himself argues for, must logically be taken beyond his own cautious fidelity to Augustine and left to blossom forth in its own implications and join the Franciscans in arguing for the primacy of Christ and the plausibility of the incarnation independent of sin. Thus, considering St. Thomas's own reasoning about the self-diffusiveness of the good and his own arguments for the fitness of the incarnation, would it not be most fitting for the good himself to, given both his self-diffusive character and his free choice to create, unite the entire cosmos summed up in its microcosm, that is man, being composed of minerality, vegetative, sensuous, and rational life, that he would unite that microcosm of the cosmos, that is man, to himself by so joining himself hypostatically with that microcosm in Christ. Now, I of course have an entire video arguing the case for just that, but I hope that this video was kind of helpful in exploring some theological and exegetical interpretations of this concept of the self-diffusiveness of the good, which is so intimately bound up with the Church's entire mystical tradition. Now, I do understand that I've primarily approached this from a Thomistic standpoint in relation to how it contrasts and I think complements the Dionysian doctrine. And I'll leave Scotists and others to expound on this concept within their own school's terms. But, this is primarily a Thomistic channel, and I think it's helpful to provide his unique insights to this concept, because I don't think that a multiplicity of approaches to this concept of the self-diffusiveness of the good, I don't think they necessarily have to be in absolute conflict with each other. I think they can complement each other and reach some form of synthesis. So I think it's valuable to expound St. Thomas's insights here. Now, I do plan on making more uploads more frequently. I plan to, again, make more videos that are a lot more simpler and introductory than this one. This one is more meant for those who are already pretty well immersed in these discussions and topics, and I want to continue to make videos for those of you who expect content like this as well. But yeah, I'm definitely going to try to upload a little bit more regularly. It's been kind of difficult lately, but I'm sure that'll be remedied very soon. God bless, and if you like the video, give it a like, subscribe, and of course, let me know what you think. Thank you.